And welcome to the Gay Liberation Network here on CAN TV. I'm your host, Andy Thayer, and with me tonight is Chris Giovannis, a longtime activist in the city of Chicago, currently with Hammerhard Media Works. Chris has been active against innumerable wars, organized in solidarity with police brutality victims, any number of activities over the years. Chris, say a few words about the kind of activity that you're involved in the city and why. You want to say a few things about El Presidente Trump?
Most recently, I've been working on issues that range from some coverage for Free Speech Radio News of what's been going on in Standing Rock, the unfolding atrocity there, in which our president-elect is directly invested. Mm-hmm. But I'm also working with some local electeds, with Chuy Garcia on moving away from the cash bond system in Chicago, and also partnering with our friends in the Chicago Community Bond Fund, who've been doing really great work in terms of getting people who are simply in jail because they're too poor not to be out. A whole host of anti-war issues and so forth. So kind of stuff I'm focusing on.
Yeah. So before we get into the heart of tonight's show, I'd like to make a few announcements about things that are going on in the city here. First of all, there have been a series of marches against the President-elect Trump, and there's one coming up tomorrow, starting at Millennium Park at 10 a.m., going to 2 p.m. There have been some really dynamic protests going on the last few nights, and we'll be showing you a number of pictures from the one and the first night after the election. So check that out tomorrow, 10 a.m., Millennium Park. And starting right on the heels of that, speaking about the pipeline that both Trump as well as Clinton had various interests in. There's going to be a Chicago in solidarity with Standing Rock demonstration. That's at Federal Plaza tomorrow. That's corner of Adams and Dearborn, 2 p.m. Please check that out. And then also coming up on Friday, Black Friday, protests against the continuing police violence against African Americans in particular in this city here, the demand for an elected police accountability council. Rahm Emanuel, in spite of all the bad press he's received about the police violence and the failure of his administration to do anything about it, has rammed through a phony reform where once again we just simply change the name of the Police Oversight Board, give it a new acronym, stuff it full of many of the same people, and once again we're going to be seeing more police violence, no doubt, with no consequences for the officers. So we'll be getting those announcements up a little bit later in the program. But Chris, I was out there on Wednesday night by Trump Tower. There were over 10,000 people, I think by conservative estimates. We were marching in the streets, kids. This was a crowd of people who were overwhelmingly less than half my age. Lots of teenagers, people not even too old to vote, lots of undocumented youth. So for those elders who say, well, why didn't you vote the right way or whatever, they couldn't vote. They were voting for their futures in the streets. Overwhelmingly people of color. I think the amazing thing, we had probably the largest demonstration here in Chicago, from what I could tell, and I think that's a direct influence of the Black Lives Matters protests that we've seen, the very dynamic immigrant youth rights struggles that we've seen, and I was seeing slogans from those demonstrations. What are your thoughts on all that, Chris?
Well, it was huge, and I know I left a couple of hours into it to go home and file my photos, and it was a constant stream of kids coming against me moving into that protest. They went on for at least another 3 hours. It was truly dazzling. And, despite the predictable, simplistic corporate media coverage that we saw of it, what was really striking was just how sophisticated and how well informed these kids were about what's at stake. Not everybody who was there were kids. I talked to one gentleman who's older than me, and I'm no spring chicken. But he was there wearing his veteran's hat, and I said, well, what are you doing here? I don't think I can say what he said to me on this show about Donald Trump, but he was also,
Sorry, FCC.
really vigorous in his complaints about people like John McCain, who Senator McCain, who's constantly touted as somehow a vets advocate. I mean, his view is basically that, these guys are all quick to pull the trigger and send people off to fight and die in foreign wars of expansion and economic exploitation that really serve a very increasingly narrow financial elite. At the expense of the rest of us.
And I think, Chris, you're hitting on something very important there, because the way for Trump was paved by both Democratic as well as Republican politicians. You look at the rest of the Republican field and the lunacy of, frankly, so many of their positions, so anti-science positions, and then we've had 8 years, or nearly 8 years, of record deportations under President Obama.
2 million
We've had police violence off the charts.
And no relief for ordinary African Americans, particularly youth, in terms of no meaningful relief really from either the federal government or certainly in urban areas like Chicago. So I think to a great, and I think it's very important to remember too that this was supposed to be a record turnout election. And, in fact, out of the 300 plus million people who live in this country and the 200 odd million who were eligible to vote, Trump barely garnered 50 million of those votes. So that's a small fraction of the people who actually call the United States home. Now, certainly there's a larger orbit around those voters that did vote Trump, but remember that there's a constituency there that's stone racist. I mean, this is a guy who was endorsed by the Ku Klux Klan. At the same time, we are also talking about, in particularly the Rust Belt states, that Clinton and the Clintonistas predictably took for granted, just as the Democratic Party's apparatchiks have taken for granted working class people, people of color, progressives, union members in general, essentially for the last 40 years, assuming that they'll go ahead and vote for them because we have nowhere else to go, while increasingly advancing a neoliberal agenda that's really lethal for these constituencies.
Well, and I think it's important to note there that both President Obama as well as Clinton back in 2008 campaigned vigorously in the Ohio and other Rust Belt primaries on being anti-NAFTA. Now, it was garbage, and we see that in retrospect, at least in terms of Obama, but it was under the first Clinton administration that we got NAFTA shoved through. And one of the point people was our own Rahm Emanuel.
Right.
So these neoliberal policies that are devastating working class people of all races, and anyway, we've got a caller here. We're going to see if we can get a caller in.
Hey, how you doing, Andy? Is it okay to call you Andy?
Oh, absolutely.
I always ask your permission.
No, you don't need to do that. Thank you, though.
First of all, now, Trump may or may not wind up being the president. I made some comments on the other shows. First of all, if he don't wind up being a one-term president, something is wrong. If he wind up getting Giuliani as the U.S. attorney, he wind up getting Newt Gingrich as his Secretary of State, and we sit back and we don't do anything about it. And I said this, if you got a problem with certain things, you need to be calling Washington, D.C. And at certain times when people have called Washington, D.C., guess what? The phone lines have shut down because it gets such a rush, it gets overloaded. We got to do those sort of things. If women out, I don't understand this. I have said this before, Andy, okay? Now, if women are so concerned about making choices over their bodies, why the heck they let racism trump sexism? And you got some white women out there, maybe you agree with me or disagree with me, you got some white women out there didn't want to lose their white privilege.
Right.
Well, 53% of white women voted for Trump.
They were willing to do that. And I say this again. Some people may want to disagree with me. See, they look, they say, okay, there's a black president, all right? We don't want to have no white woman as a president. And then I said it before, all right? Then somewhere down the line, they say we're going to have a gay president. They don't want those sort of things.
Right.
You got some people in those little small towns got their type of ideas and stuff.
Right.
And they came out in record numbers and voted.
Yeah.
Right.
And that is particularly true, yeah.
Well, and the Christian right also mobilized really, really aggressively for this
That's all I
candidate.
wanna say. Take
More than the Christian right organized for Mitt Romney, their previous candidate. So those slice and dice segments of the ultra right really mobilized for Trump. And the fact is that the Democratic National Committee colluded willfully with the Clinton administration to make sure that a more appealing candidate, for example, like Bernie Sanders,
Right.
was never going to get a shot at
Debbie
this office at all.
Wasserman Schultz,
Donna Brazile. I mean, this was an organized strategy on the part of the DNC apparatchiks to make sure that a progressive populist like Sanders was never going to get a fair shot at the candidacy. They lined up superdelegates
Right.
early. That's a system that's got to go. I mean, but I think the deeper question that we have to ask is, okay, so we know there's a hardcore stone racist contingent here. And it's not just uneducated rural whites, because not all of those folks voted for Donald Trump. A fair number of those folks just didn't vote because, for crying out loud, what kind of a choice was on offer here, right? Many of them did vote for Clinton, holding their nose, and that's the operative, I think, concept here.
Yeah.
People had to hold their noses to vote for Hillary Clinton because they looked at her legacy under her husband's administration. And it's not just things like NAFTA that made the Clinton administration a disaster. One of the reasons we have such soaring incarceration rates amongst people of color, particularly African American men, is because of the legacy of criminal justice policies that Bill Clinton himself handed to us. So these are, in many respects, parties with infrastructures and leadership that, neither of which really address the core economic, social justice concerns of the people of this nation.
And one thing I'd like to shift gears on here. So it was said many times in the run-up to the campaign just how loathed both of these candidates were. And much was made of that and was absolutely true. But I should point out that this is not the first time that we have had two candidates that absolutely disgusted the vast majority of people in this country. I actually point back to 1968 because I think it's very instructive, not just about what happens in that situation, but also what we can do about it. Because in 1968, not too many blocks away from here, the police under Richard J. Daley were cracking people's heads, and people called themselves progressives and so forth, if they had any allegiance to the Democratic Party at that point at all, were disgusted in the main. And many of them dropped out of electoral politics. Richard M. Nixon, who ideologically is actually firmer on the right when he was still alive than Donald, who is a weather vane depending on which way his whim goes and which way he thinks he can go forward. We had Richard Milhous Nixon into office, ideologically probably the most right-wing president of the post-World War II era, and yet he ended up being, in practice, the most liberal, quote-unquote, president because he was forced to, because people were flooding the streets of America. They were doing exactly what kids were doing, and a few of us elders, on Wednesday, Thursday night, and will be hopefully doing in the future, because they made the United States ungovernable. And when you've got a rapist in the White House, when you've got a person who doesn't think he needs to pay his taxes, and yet working class people do, people are going to take measures into their own hands. And so as awful as the situation is of having a out front KKK endorsed racist in the White House, I think it doesn't mean that all hope is lost. We do have a caller. We'll try and squeeze them in here quick.
Yeah, hello?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, good evening to y'all. Since the other state vote for Trump, they got him in there. Now they protesting. What they should have did, instead of voting for Trump, they should have voted for Hillary. Since Hillary ain't gonna be president, and since they voted for Trump, and now they protesting, and they brought that stuff on themselves. And my name is James. Y'all doing a good job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I have to tell you, I don't think there was a soul marching on the streets in Chicago the day after the election that voted for Trump. Not a soul. And let's be very clear, for what it's worth, as incredibly high as Hillary Clinton's negatives were, the reality is that a whole boatload of people, right now, according to the turnout numbers, a majority of people who voted actually did hold their noses and vote for Clinton. Some folks voted very enthusiastically for Clinton. I mean, we have to be candid about this. You know, I think particularly for a lot of older women, you know, many folks in the African American community, you know, really looked at Clinton as an opportunity to carry on what they see as positives in the Obama administration. Despite the fact that one could argue that there are some very, very grave downsides as a consequence of the last 8 years of this administration, the outgoing administration. But the people who were in the streets on Wednesday were not people who voted for Trump. And the majority of Americans who voted on Tuesday did not vote for Trump. Because we have a cooked system that is rooted in slavery. The Electoral College system was put in place by a bunch of white male slaveholders, and it has been used on 3 occasions now. In 2000, in the Gore-Bush battle, in this electoral season, to basically flip the script on the popular vote versus the Electoral College vote. But most significantly, it was used to derail the campaign of a presidential candidate in the 1870s that basically completely annihilated Reconstruction and all of the work that was being done after the Civil War to bring real economic and social equality to former slaves, particularly in the South, but really all over this country, but particularly in the Deep South. So that's what the Electoral College is for, right? I mean, it's really there to be able to make it possible to do things like this. So, you know, we can talk for, you know, another like 2 days or 2 weeks or 2 months about why we have the outcome that we're living with now. I actually think it's more important to talk about what we need to do going forward.
Yes.
And I think that what you said about people hitting the streets and really, you know, building up, you know, organizations and mass resistance to Richard Nixon is really, really important, because the fact is that under the Nixon administration, we got things like the Clean Water Act, and we got it because they were forced in Washington to actually do these things.
Affirmative action.
There's an old adage out there amongst organizers that, you know, electoral expression is really one tactic in a much larger strategy of organizing mass resistance to intolerable conditions, and to push forward more progressive agendas. And we've got to start doing that yesterday. And fortunately, we have very active and vibrant social resistance movements like Black Lives Matter, like the grassroots-based portion of the immigrant rights movement that particularly includes undocumented youth who've just thrown down the gauntlet and said, you know, I may be afraid, I will not be silent. And we've got an enormous opportunity here under some very dire circumstances, I think, to actually stitch together the different components of these vibrant movements. We saw that happen. We saw that coming together on the streets of Chicago on Wednesday. We saw that happening in large protest mobilizations that were really practically spontaneous, right? All over the country on Wednesday and Thursday. And you know, people who resist this administration understand what's at stake and understand that a huge part of our strength is in our unity. So you saw people out there with signs that said, you know, we are defending our Muslim, you know,
sisters and brothers.
Sisters and brothers. We are defending our black sisters and brothers. We are defending our Latino sisters and brothers. We are here to defend immigrants. We are here to defend girls and women in their right, you know, to control their own bodies and not have that dictated to by some Nazi autocrat from D.C. and his minions.
And that's something.
And that is very powerful. That's what we've got to build on.
That's something I'd like to pick up on, because one of the Democrats' memes has been, elect us and we'll defend Roe v. Wade. And yet those of us who are old enough to know, have lived through the past few decades, have seen the right to abortion be whittled away so that it's become increasingly a province just of wealthier women who can afford to travel hundreds of miles sometimes. And just, I wanted to pull up this one.
Those are, by the way, the same wealthy women who voted for Donald Trump. I mean, the reality is,
well, the 53%,
you know, one of the myths that came out of the Clinton administration and all their so-called vaunted data mining was that, you know, college-educated whites were going to vote for Hillary Clinton. Well, actually, they did not. And, in fact, more wealthy people in this country, overwhelmingly white, including women, voted for Hillary. So.
Well, I'd just like to pull
for
up
Trump,
this
rather.
particular sign. Really, there was a lot of not only we're going to defend our brothers and sisters, whether they're Muslim, Black, Latino, undocumented, what have you, but this sort of sign, the voices of all our abusers are now the president.
Yeah.
This is a man who thinks that he can openly espouse sexual assault without any consequences. And so the anger that, there was a chant about, we'll defend your right, the men, and women would answer, we will defend our right. And it was really taken up over and over again by the entire crowd. People marching down Lakeshore Drive, people marching down, regardless of their background, saying that they're in favor of the rights of the undocumented, standing for immigrant rights, standing against the fear-mongering against them. And so I think it was really, really powerful what we saw on display, and I think we're just beginning to see the beginning of it. Now, we're unfortunately running out of time. Chris, some quick closing thoughts about what people should be doing going forward.
Well, I want to remind folks that the protests that broke out all over the nation on Wednesday and Thursday were literally organized by calls that went up on social media. And we don't need a handful of leaders who claim they know best for us to call these kinds of protests. And one of the things that I thought was really powerful about Wednesday in Chicago was the impromptu speak-outs that sprang up, which was really democracy and dialogue, in its best. And that's the kind of effort that we've got to sustain going forward.
Yeah, and if you want to do more going forward, there's plenty of opportunities right here in the city of Chicago in the next few weeks for you to do that. Starting with just tomorrow here, I'm going to pull this up on your screen here, there's going to be yet another demonstration against President Trump. I gag as I say that. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. at Millennium Park over by Randolph and Michigan Avenue. Please check that out. And then just later that day, 2 p.m., standing in solidarity with Standing Rock, Native Americans standing up for water rights. There's going to be a demonstration and I believe a cultural presentation as well led by Native Americans tomorrow, Federal Plaza, corner of Adams and Dearborn at 2 p.m. Coming up, some of you may know that myself as well as others have been involved in a demonstration in getting the City Council to abide by the Open Meetings Act. That's when the next big hearing on that is. And then demonstrating for an elected Police Accountability Council coming up soon. So we're going to wrap it up there. Thanks so much for watching tonight.